The Conservative Party of Canada is in Calgary this weekend for their national convention. Pierre Poilievre's leadership will be voted on. Recently, Poilievre has drawn the ire of the Coastal First Nations Coalition in British Columbia over his social media posts. The Heiltsuk Nation are coalition members. They're calling his posts dangerous disinformation. Now questions are being asked about who the coalition speaks for. Our Truth and Politics panel is here to sort this out. Jennifer Laewetz is CEO of Paskwâw Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Great to see you both, as always. Jen, we'll start with you as you're in Calgary trying to attend the Conservative Convention. And it's not just Pierre Poilievre who has been questioning the validity of the Coastal First Nations. There's been some right-leaning news outlets doing stories. BC Conservative leadership candidate Yuri Fulmer called them an advocacy group funded by foreign anti-energy and anti-resource groups. What's going on here?
Yeah, so happy to be in Calgary and hopefully have some exciting updates from the convention that's taking place here. And I am going to be curious what the conversation is around pipelines and even the coastal group out of BC, because we're hearing a lot of conversation around resource development, and there's been op-eds, there's been a lot of conversation coming out. Pierre Poilievre has been attacked on his take on this. I think what is happening is a lot of people are forgetting what the difference is between an actual rights holder and, maybe a treaty alliance group or an organization or an advocacy body. And we have to be very careful that we separate those two, especially in conversations like this. It is essentially supposed to be the rights holders and the people that are directly above with the authority over the rights holders, chief and councils, things like that, when it comes to giving that consultation and that consent. And this always happens anytime there's conversation around resource development or pipelines. We kind of drive home the loudest voices, and I find that the actual rights holders, which this group is not a rights holder, there are, not numbered treaties in BC like there is in Saskatchewan, so it's a much different playing field, but we have to go back to what the grassroots and the communities want and make sure that if there is participation in resource development, that we are actually at that table and it's not high-level bodies that are making those decisions on behalf of us.
Niigaan, what's your understanding of who the Coastal First Nations are and who they represent?
Well, they aren't really a regional chiefs group. What they are is they're a set of alliance of both organizations, and there are government members who represent their own interests, but are part of the interaction in that organization. In many ways, I would kind of call them a kind of NGO, maybe a non-governmental organization that certainly has a great deal of influence and a great deal of power in terms of talking about the ways in which First Nations, coastal BC First Nations, what it is that they're interested in doing, of course, involved with understanding the environment intimately, and of course, understanding kind of tribal politics in BC. We have to remember that in BC, what you have is you have Indian Act leadership, which is recognized under the federal government, and then hereditary leadership, which is tribal law, and is oftentimes not recognized by the federal government, or if it is, it's usually considered a second-tier government in some way, especially when it comes to consultation. And so you've already got a sort of unofficial, non-recognized by the federal government, anyways, recognized by Indigenous peoples, systems of government in operation. So in many ways, there are lots of people in BC who would see the Coastal First Nations as a kind of government-like body, a body that represents the will and the interests of the people. So it's a complicated answer. It's how would you recognize, for instance, a regional body in certain areas of the country, like the Southern Chiefs Organization in Manitoba, or the Manitoba Kiwetnuk Ogamuk in Manitoba, the Northern Chiefs Organization. They are not really a governing body, and as Jen mentioned before, they're not rights holders because they don't recognize, or they're not recognized as having rights over making decisions for First Nations, but extremely influential. Hold forums, hold bodies, and collectively make decisions together to act as one. So I think in many ways it's a complicated answer.
Jen, is this a disinformation campaign by some media and politicians against the Coastal First Nations, as they allege?
I think so. I think it's both. I think that there will be heavily dependent organizations that lean into groups like this that, you know, our advocacy groups when it comes to the environment and policy around the environment that are really hoping that they find those bodies that have some form of legitimacy to essentially push narratives. We are all susceptible to it. Political parties, NGOs, whatever they might be, there's always advocacy groups that will try to find that in. So I don't think the criticism of the Coastal First Nations is entirely, you know, incorrect or not allowed, but I would caution that people remember that, you know, again, they are not a treaty rights holder, but that doesn't mean that they don't speak for First Nations or Indigenous people in some capacity. You know, we see that in Saskatchewan. We have tribal councils, we have the FSIN that has been given a mandate on behalf of First Nations to advocate and to be essentially their lobbying group. And that is where things get a little bit messy, is I'm hearing so much conversation around, well, they're not even elected by, you know, an actual like member of a First Nation, like they're, you know, a group, or they're this or they're that. But it's like, yeah, but you have to remember that sometimes we give some of that power or give some of that authority over to different various organizations. You know, again, the FSIN is a very good example of that in Saskatchewan, where our chiefs and our nations have asked for that advocacy and have signed on into that organization to advocate on behalf of them. So things are getting really, really tricky. And I think this is just a prime example of why government and every political party needs to up their policies around consultation and consent and create a viable framework that works so they don't end up on the other side of the fight that comes from not having that in place.
Niigaan, when it comes to a pipeline to the West Coast, the Coastal First Nations have been firm, saying a no is a no. But does that mean that all First Nations in British Columbia are against any new pipeline there?
Again, it's like, which leadership are we talking about? I mean, we're talking about Indian Act leadership, we're talking about hereditary leadership. Oftentimes they are at loggerheads. You may get support from Indian Act leadership, and I think certainly some BC First Nations, especially ones that are invested in economic development and have economic goals, good, bad, great, ugly, for whatever reasons that they're driving for, may have interests in kind of the large loan programs that are offered by the federal government to own pieces, to consult, to participate more meaningfully. I would say, though, that in terms of grassroots people, pipelines are extremely unpopular. They are extremely not supported by many people who are on the front lines, who are ceremonial, traditional people. You don't get a lot of pickup for big extractive, earth-damaging projects. And so Coastal First Nations is made up of those kinds of people who don't feel represented by certain types of leadership, have moved towards a different model. And, you know, I got news for everybody, and I hope that what the big message that comes out of this segment, which can feel very confusing, like, what is the Coastal First Nations? What are these bodies of Indigenous governments that aren't really governments and that are actually lobby groups, or like, people misunderstand and First Nations organizations and operations because it takes a lot of nuance, a lot of understanding, and it really takes a time spent with our people regionally, often geographically, culturally, to understand like how we operate. Like, for instance, like the Indian Act leadership is never the leadership that First Nations would have chosen. We would have chosen leadership that's by clans, by cultures, chosen by grandmothers. And all of that involves a whole lot of nuance and understanding the specifics of regions of Indigenous peoples, cultures of Indigenous peoples, and which all is different all across the country.
We'll leave it there, and we're going to talk more about the Conservative Convention over on the podcast. Thanks to you both.
Miigwech.
Well, Jen, as mentioned, you're just kicking back in your hotel there, hoping that you're going to make it over to the convention. There will be a vote on the party's confidence in its leader, despite not being on the ground, I guess. Well, what are you hearing and what could happen there?
Well, I was actually seeing on social media this morning that apparently some insiders to the party are talking about how they are expecting, or there is a certain level of expectation, that Pierre reaches the same threshold that Stephen Harper did during his leadership back in the early 2000s, which is 84% of the 2,900 delegates. I don't think it's a shock to anyone that it's very conveniently placed in Alberta, which is, you know, aside from Saskatchewan, conservative country. And he has the most support here than I would say he has anywhere else. So it'll be very, very telling what that looks like. And yeah, I'm hopeful to get in. I did not register ahead of time, so we were all hoping for the best. And if I don't get in, then we will have more stories about that and why I'm not allowed in.
Just go live as you're banging on the door there for us so that we can all watch. Niigaan, do you think Poilievre's going to hang on to his leadership, and is that the right move for the party right now?
I think Poilievre will hold on to the leadership. I actually don't know if it really matters whether it's 60% or 80%, because I think Poilievre's going to hold on to the leadership and go into another election cycle no matter what. He has nothing else. I mean, this is a career politician. This is somebody who has spent his whole life and career building for this moment. He's not going to give it up on one federal election cycle. He's going to go for at least two. And the party leadership will not push him out until such time that there is a major cacophony, a majority, which in the case of a 60% vote is not a majority. You will see a conservative party that will hope for the best and will hope for to get some kind of issue, some kind of moment, maybe a stumble by Carney, some kind of way in which they can get that same kind of momentum that Poilievre really found in the days leading to the end of Justin Trudeau's reign as Prime Minister. I mean, think back to where they were 25 points ahead in the polls. What Poilievre was doing was a brilliant playbook. It was mostly social media driven. It was mostly based within sort of taglines, messages, slogans. And then, of course, it was being out and very much controlling the message of caucus. All of those things are gone now. Like there isn't a social media presence of the Conservatives other than in their base, which is fractious and all over the place. Their kind of coalition is broken. Secondly, there isn't a whole lot of Teflon for Poilievre. He lost his own seat, and he's been too busy trying to worry about whether he can maintain some sort of sense of unity amongst. He has people who are leaving and going over to the Liberals. He's got a Liberal Party that's now occupying much of the space that the Conservatives then occupied in the middle for policy development. And then he's fighting for his own life as leader. All of those things are gone, but none of those things have led to him even openly musing about doing something else with his career. With most politicians, what you'll see is you'll sort of see some sort of game plan start or some kind of way in which you batten down the hatches and create some kind of sense of a very close unity amongst a few people, or at least combative fighting within your own party. What you see is a Poilievre who's quite comfortable. I mean, he hasn't made many statements. Other than a few shots and jabs, throwing spaghetti against the wall, trying to get something to stick to Carney. What you've seen is a Poilievre who I think feels very confident, even with a 60% vote, that he's going to continue and go on to the next election cycle.
Jen, aside from the leadership review, is there anything else that you're watching for at the convention?
There will be a lot that I'm watching for in terms of how their policy is debated. Especially when it kind of tells you the direction of the party. And I often remind people, even as Indigenous people, we should be occupying these spaces. Anywhere where there is any even slight chance of power being held, whether it's the opposition or which is the government in waiting, we should be occupying these spaces. The tricky thing is that what exists right now in politics is the partisanship and there's the political ideology, and somehow those blur in the middle. And, you know, the Conservative Party has not traditionally been the party of reconciliation. They have not been the party for Indigenous people. It's just not a priority for them. But we are starting to see Indigenous people come in and be MPs in this party. Former Chief Billy Morin, Ellis Ross. And those are the areas where it's like, yes, okay, we see our representation in that party, but that still doesn't cross off what we need to be concerned about when it comes to policy around resource development. Where do you stand on that? Where do you stand on the treatment of, you know, Indigenous people in this country when it comes to consultation and consent? Where are your priorities with the TRC calls to action? All of those things matter, and our advocacy can also look a little bit different. We do not need to enter these spaces of trying to, you know, promote these things or sell these things or even think that it should ever replace our governance systems, because it shouldn't. But I still think anywhere where power lies or there's potential for power, we should be occupying those spaces, and we can go into them as advocates rather than, you know, partisans that say everything here is fine, don't worry, reconciliation can wait another day. Because truth be told, every party should be seeing more of us inside of those spaces, because I think it would, you know, light a little bit of a fire that needs to be lit under their butts when it comes to representation and what matters to our people. So.
Well, Jennifer, Niigaan, we'll leave it there. Jen, we'll keep an eye on your social media. If you don't get in, I hope you find a good spa out there at least.
You could do some kind of some online campaign. Get Jen in.
Yes.
Get Jen in.
All right. Thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks.